Rhombus, circumscribed, angles, this thing. It's geometry. With me, Miss Cohen.
We are today doing Unit 2, Lesson 5, which is congruent triangles. So please fill out your table of contents, pause if you need to, and then find a new page. And again, go ahead and pause if you need to, but write today's date at the top, and then Unit 2, Lesson 5. And the essential question today is, how can you tell if two triangles are congruent? And so I have here two triangles that I cut out, and I want to know if they're congruent. And so that just simply means, are they exactly the same? Same shape, same size. And they look like they might be. If I flip them over, I've marked on one. If I flip them over, they don't quite line up. So they don't line up that way, but if I flip and rotate them in just the right way, they will perfectly line up. And so these triangles are congruent. And what that means, if I'm dealing with two congruent triangles, that means all the sides are congruent. So that means the corresponding sides, right? So these sides are congruent, these sides are congruent, and these sides are congruent. And their corresponding angles are also congruent. So these angles are congruent, so are these, and so are these. So I know you can't do this because you don't have two little triangles, but these two triangles are congruent because all of their corresponding parts are congruent. Their corresponding sides are congruent and their corresponding angles are congruent. And even if I flip one and rotate them, they're still considered congruent triangles. So we're going to just answer the essential question now. How can we tell if two triangles are congruent? So if the corresponding parts are congruent, then the triangles are congruent. So that is just a fact. If all the corresponding parts are congruent, then the triangles are congruent. Corresponding just means matching. And then the converse of this is also true. We talked about converses last class, but if I flip the if and the then statement, we have another true statement. So in this case, if the triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are as well. Okay, so go ahead and get all that down. And then it's a little hard to understand what all of this means without seeing some examples. So let's go ahead and start with example 1. We're going to draw two triangles, and just to make it simple on our graph paper, let's try to make right triangles. They're just a little easier to draw. So go ahead and draw that triangle, and then we're going to draw another right triangle next to it that's sort of upside down. Flipped and rotated. And we're going to label the parts here. So I'm going to go G, H, J. Those are my three vertices of the first triangle, and then I have L, M, K. Those are the vertices of my second triangle, and then I also want to go through and label some of the other angles. So this is 60 degrees, 30 degrees, 30 degrees, 60 degrees. And then finally, this is a lot, but finally we're going to label some side lengths. 2 meters, 1.7 meters, 1 meter, and then here we have 1 meter, 1.7 meters, and 2 meters. So that's a lot. Please feel free to pause if you need to get all that down. And the question we want to answer here is, are they congruent? Yes or no? And I'm really hoping that you can look at these and say, yes, they're congruent. They're pretty obviously congruent. What I want to focus on here is listing all the corresponding parts to show that all the corresponding parts are congruent, and this part can be a little bit tricky. So a triangle has 3 sides and 3 angles, and so we're going to find all the corresponding angles and all the corresponding sides. So let's start with the angles. Corresponding angles. So I'm going to start with angle G. So angle G is congruent to which other angle? So it's 30 degrees. So obviously it's going to be congruent to angle K. That's supposed to be angle K. So these are considered corresponding angles. They're congruent. They're corresponding angles. It's the same angle on the 2 different triangles. Go ahead and list the other 2 sets of corresponding angles and show that they're congruent. So we have here that angle J is congruent to, that's 60 degrees, angle M, and then those are both 60 degrees. So these are corresponding angles on the 2 triangles. And then finally, angle H is congruent to angle L. Those are 90-degree angles. So sometimes the angles, the corresponding parts will be sort of in the same position. In this case, they're not because the triangle has been rotated. So you have to just look at the angle measure and make sure you're matching them up properly. And then, of course, we also have corresponding sides. And we're going to show that the corresponding sides are congruent as well. So why don't we start with the hypotenuse of this triangle? We have GJ is congruent to, so GJ is 2 meters. Its corresponding side is over here, MK, and those both equal 2 meters, so they're congruent. Please find the other 2 sets and then check up here when you're done. So go ahead and look up here and see if you got the same thing that I did. GH is this side, it's 1.7 meters, and then that is congruent to KL. And I put the K first just because G and K are the corresponding vertices and I wanted to be consistent. I didn't do that here, and it would have been a little better if I had flipped them around just because G and K are corresponding angles, and so it's good to write them in the same order. It's not wrong this way, but it's better to do it this way. So J here is the same angle as corresponding with M, and so I put M first here. So we've got 3 sets of corresponding angles, 3 sets of corresponding sides. Therefore, the triangles are congruent. And so we're going to write a congruent statement here. And this is really important. The order matters. For the first triangle, we're going to write triangle, and you can put the letters in any order that you want. So maybe we'll say G, H, J. That's the name of this triangle. You just go around and list all the vertices, and that is congruent to, and now we must list these angles in the same order based on what each of these corresponds with. So G corresponds with K, and so we have to put the K first. H corresponds with L. H is the 90-degree angle, so the L must go second. J over here is the 60-degree angle, and that corresponds with M. So there are several ways to write the congruent statement, but once you've decided the order of the letters in your first triangle, you have to put the second triangle's letters in the same order based on the corresponding parts. So that is the congruent statement. Let's do a second example. So for this example, we're going to actually use some algebra to to figure out some corresponding parts. So let's see. We're going to draw an obtuse triangle here. So something like that. And we're going to label the vertices A, B, and C. We're going to label some side lengths. This is 36 millimeters. This will be 30 millimeters. And this one down here will be 50 millimeters. And then I'm not going to label the angle measures, but I am going to put little marks to show what's congruent. So we're going to do one loop there, two loops there, and three loops there. This is an alternative way of showing angle congruence. Normally I put the tick marks, but I want you to see this because this is another way of showing it. And then we're going to draw our second triangle up here, and we're going to sort of put it upside down. So a long horizontal line, and then something like that. And this will be D, E, F. Let's label our side lengths. So we have an expression here instead of a side length. And then let's go ahead and put loops in each angle. D will receive one loop. E will receive three loops. And F will receive two loops. So the first thing that we're going to do, I'm telling you in this case that the triangles are congruent, and I want us to write the congruent statement. So we'll start with our first triangle, and we're going to say triangle ABC, and I could have put those in any order, is congruent to triangle, and now we need to find the corresponding parts. A has one loop, and so does D, so D has to go first. B has three loops, and that's second, so whatever has three loops over here has to go second. C has two loops, and so does F, so that has to go third. So the order really matters here. So there's our congruent statement, and we kind of figured out our corresponding angles. A and D are corresponding and congruent because of the marks. B and E are corresponding and congruent, and C and F are corresponding and congruent. So I've got three congruent angles, and we know we have three congruent sides because I told you that the triangles are congruent. And so we can see that BC and EF are corresponding. They're 30 millimeters. We can see that AC and DF are corresponding. They're 50 millimeters. And so that must mean that AB corresponds with DE. And I can see that a few different ways. AB is 36 millimeters, and because we were careful about how we wrote that, AB that's the first two letters in my congruent statement here. So it has to correspond with the two letters here. AB must be congruent to DE because they're the first two letters here and the first two letters here. And if that's true, then those sides must be equal. So I can now kind of figure out what Y is by setting up an equation. AB is 36 millimeters, and that must be equal to DE, which is 2Y plus 20. So we can solve that equation to figure out what value of Y would make these triangles congruent. So go ahead and do it. This is a pretty simple one to solve, and look up here when you're done. So hopefully you got Y equals 8. This lesson today I think is pretty easy. Certainly knowing whether two triangles are congruent is easy. You just look at the sides and the angles and make sure everything matches. I think the challenge in this lesson is knowing how to put everything in order and making sure that you can identify corresponding parts using not only the numbers, because that's easy, but using the order of your congruent statement. So that's what's really key about this lesson today. Go ahead and take a moment and write a summary before you put your notebook away. I would kind of put mine right here. And the essential question today was, how can you tell if triangles are congruent? So go ahead and take a minute and answer that question in your summary.